check a few times to make sure I was really in Southern California. Just a few days ago, actually, I went to a seminar at Google where one of the people that works with me presented a nice talk on the impact of the weather on Google. So if you look at Google queries in different locations, especially locations that have weather, you see quite an impact. And what turned out the bottom line summary was it's good for Google if the weather's bad, but not too bad. So if it's bad, people stay inside at their computers and search like they're supposed to do, but if it's too bad, the power goes out and they can't do anything. Okay, so today I want to talk to you not so much about the sociology or the behavioral aspects of Internet search, but really about the economics of Internet search. And as everybody knows, everybody uses search engines. Now, these numbers are old numbers from the Pew Foundation, but it says 84% of Internet users have used search. And I would say, what do the other 16% do? It's unclear. Lots of people use search engines on any given day. And, of course, as we all know, they're highly profitable. So with the search engines, the business model is selling ads. So I'm going to talk about the economics of Internet search. I want to talk a bit about how that ad business works. So the ads that you see in search engines are highly relevant. They're the gold standard as far as ads are concerned. But even so, advertising is still a small impact business in some ways. You look at search, about 2% of the ads might get clicks. Maybe 2% of those clicks might end up in a conversion. So you're talking about 4 out of 1,000 people that see the ads actually buy. And the amazing thing about it is that's good. That's good performance. If you think about an ad that you see on TV or an ad that you see in the newspaper or a billboard or almost any other medium, the impact of those ads on actual purchases is a very, very tiny number, on the order of 1 out of 1,000 or less. And so what that means is, to really work, advertising has to have scale, and that scale is pretty critical to the business. So to give you a little example from another medium, if you look at the history of radio, people try to figure out a business model for broadcast radio. And of course, it had this problem of no exclusion. Anybody who wanted to could listen to the broadcast signal. So the challenge, they tried commercials, and the challenge with radio commercials was that the signal could only cover a given geographic area, so you had to have a high enough population density that enough people would see the ad that would translate into sales, that would pay for the generation of content that would encourage enough people to listen to go buy the ad, and that really, to go buy the product. So that meant really that there were only a few cities in the United States that could actually support commercial radio broadcast model: New York, Chicago, LA, a few other places. And then AT&T got into the act and said, wait, we can carry those radio signals from one radio station to another over copper, rebroadcast it, so you don't have to create a new content in every city. You can just create one set of content that then can be broadcast around the country, and that was the big breakthrough. So that allowed for the development of radio networks and then ultimately TV networks, but it was all being able to use the limited amount of content that was being produced, sell ads against it, and do that in a scale business. And the Internet is very much like that. So if you look at the other side of the business, that's the demand side, you look at the supply side, and of course there is a business where you have a high fixed cost and low marginal cost. There's a very high fixed cost to create those data centers and a relatively low marginal cost to answer an extra query. In some sense, the whole web business is in the middle of a transition now because of all these fixed costs that are being turned into variable costs. So you're familiar with Amazon that will sell storage on demand, and Google started a service where they sell storage and web hosting. So you're changing what was previously a big upfront investment into an investment that's a variable cost that can be scaled as your business expands. And I think that's going to have a very big impact because it allows for a lot of smaller niche services that weren't economically viable before have now become economically viable. So if you put those together, you've got these situations where the entry costs are fairly high, at least traditionally, because you had to enter at a reasonably large scale. The user switching costs are very, very low. So as we say at Google, the competition's only a click away. Most people do use multiple search engines in a given month. Maybe you have a preferred search engine, but if you don't find what you want on Google, you might look in one of those other search engines. And of course, the advertisers follow the eyeballs. So one of the things that's funny about the business is if you say you're buying ads on Google, well, typically then you'll buy ads on other search engines as well, right? It's just like Time and Newsweek. If you're Ford, if you advertise in Newsweek, well, you advertise in Time. If you're Amazon, you'll advertise on Yahoo, Google, MSN, everybody else, because there's no real reason to have you're able to reach those extra eyeballs, so why not do it? And so what that means is the market structure that we'd expect to see in that kind of industry is a few large search engines in each country and group, and indeed that's the model that we typically see, a highly contestable market for users. So people are competing very intensely to acquire those users. But then you've got a situation where the advertisers are pretty much following the users. And you may have just seen yesterday there's been a new chess move in this game where MSN announced that it was going to give rebates on consumer purchases on ads that were shown on MSN. So it's kind of like the credit card business. If you have certain credit cards, they'll give you 1% of your purchases back. So now MSN is saying we'll give you some fraction of your purchases back. Why are they doing that? Well, obviously they're hoping to attract the users. If they attract the users, the advertisers follow, and then they hope that they can build up that business, sort of jumpstart the whole business by offering those cash rebates. So that's a kind of interesting new development. And unlike many online businesses, I would argue that they're relatively small network effects. So there isn't any reason why you'd expect to see this industry converge to a single player or a very small set of players that arise from network effects or even the supply-side economies of scale. There's still, in my view at least, plenty of room for new entrants, in part because of the phenomenon I mentioned earlier, that people are willing to try new search engines because, well, why not? It's just a click away. So my feeling is the industry is going to continue to be a pretty vibrant industry for several years. Now, one way to think about what Google does, this is a matchmaker. It's a two-sided market, or yenta, which is Yiddish for matchmaker. You're matching up people that are seeking information to people who have information, and you're matching up buyers and sellers. So the performance of the industry is going to depend on the quality of those matches. So the better matches you can make, the better you're going to be doing in terms of your performance. So there's two strands of literature I want to talk about a little bit. One is the information science literature on information retrieval, which is maybe 30 years old or so. And the other is the economics literature on what's called the assignment problem, where the issue is how do you make good assignments of the sort I was just alluding to. So I'm going to talk first about information retrieval. And I should tell you this, my view, the little history of information retrieval that I'm going to go through in the next few minutes is a very abbreviated version of a much longer story, but I think it's should get my point across. All right, so what happened? Pretty much as soon as there were computers, people started putting textual documents on computers, and then they wanted ways to retrieve those textual documents. And so this field began in the 1970s, where basically you were doing a glorified grep of trying to look through a bunch of documents and find documents that contained certain words or phrases. And like a lot of fields, that proceeded very rapidly at the beginning. You had great progress, and then things slowed down after a while. And by the late 80s, it was pretty much a mature field. So then the DARPA and the National Institute of Standards and Technology decided to light a fire under this field because it was very important for lots of applications. And they started something called the TREC, the Text Retrieval Conference. And what they did for that was very interesting. They provided a CD, which then was a pretty new a pretty new technology. They provided a CD that contained a number of documents and a number of queries. So there are lots of documents. For example, they got a year's worth of articles from the Wall Street Journal. And they got encyclopedia entries and lots of other textual documents. And then they had a bunch of queries. And then they commissioned experts, people like reference librarians and CIA analysts and all sorts of people who were familiar with the subject matter, and had those people indicate which documents were relevant to which queries. So you got this big set of data. They sent out the CD to the 30 or so research teams that were working in this area, and said, here you are, train your systems on this data. So all of them took the data, they trained their systems, they tried to each try out their algorithm that they preferred for doing this information retrieval, and then they went to the main conference, the TREC conference, and were given new data, this time without the answers, just the queries and the documents, but no indication of relevance, and then everybody tried to use their system on this new, fresh set of data, and it was a bit of a competition. So they didn't really, some people called it a shootout, where they were trying to see whose system performed best, and it gave you certain bragging rights if you had the best performer for that year. So an example of one of the algorithms that was used is a probabilistic matching, where you had probability that the document was relevant to the query with some function of the characteristics of the document in query. And a very standard way to do that is to use a logistic regression, where the log odds is a linear function of the characteristics. So a typical set of explanatory variables in this context might be things like the terms in common, the query length, the collection size, the frequency of occurrence of the term in the document, and so on. And each of those would be explanatory variables for this probability of relevance judgment. So these algorithms then, the TREC conference gave a big boost to information retrieval. There were a lot, because they had a standardized collection of documents, because they had a way that methods could be compared against each other, and they had these public competition. You saw a significant boost in the field. But then by the middle of the 1990s, the algorithms for information retrieval were pretty mature, and again, the innovation or the level of development was in the order of 1% or 2% at each TREC conference, and wasn't really doing a lot of action. Well, then the web comes along, and people began to realize that we needed search engines for the web, immediately turned to these information retrieval engines, and computer scientists got interested. Before, this was mostly people who were just specializing in information retrieval. Some people were in the computer science area. Some people were out of library science, information science, a variety of different areas. And what they realized, I think, particularly the computer science researchers, the link structure of the web became a new explanatory variable. So instead of just looking at the documents and queries on a single basis, you could use the fact that some documents pointed to other documents, and that was, in fact, a useful variable that had not been part of TREC, right? TREC was just a flat document structure. And here you had this particular structure that was imposed by the web. So now in the mid-90s then, as everybody knows, Brin and Page came up with this idea of PageRank, where you measured how many important sites linked to a given site, and that had a quite significant improvement on the relevance, the performance of web search results. So they tried to sell their algorithm to Yahoo for $1 million, but Yahoo thought that was too expensive, because at this time it was widely viewed, and I can attest to this because people would come into my office and tell me that search, that was a totally commoditized business. There were a few standard algorithms that were out there. They all performed about as well as the other, and there wasn't any way it was going to get bigger, and there definitely weren't any commercial opportunities available. And this is the conventional wisdom circa 1995. It's widely believed. And the reason I know this is we were debating the curriculum at the information school at Berkeley, and obviously we're going to have databases, and obviously we'd have some intellectual property and policy and other things, but the question was, should we put in search? And there were arguments on both sides. Lots of people thought it was just something where you went and looked things up in a book and copied out the algorithm, and there you were. All right. Well, what's interesting is Larry and Sergey were two of the few people that didn't believe this. They thought it was possible to improve the quality of search, and they started Google. They had no real idea of how they were going to make money. At that time, the model that was the most likely would be selling search appliances to businesses for intranet search, but everybody else was pretty much convinced search would be commodified, and nobody could come up with a good business model, much like the story I told you of broadcast radio. Well, what happened then is a kind of nice story that really emanated out of Caltech. A company called GoTo came up with this model of auctioning search results. So they said, instead of using an algorithm to determine which search results are best, we'll just let people bid on their search results, and you type in a query, the highest bidder gets the first place in the search results. Well, that model didn't really work out very well because people wanted some kind of objective determination of search results. But GoTo changed its model and its name, became Overture, and they then said, let's auction off ads. So the search results were determined algorithmically, but the ads were determined via an auction. So Google saw this in the fall of 2001, saw what Overture had done, and thought that was a pretty good idea because Google would run up against this problem of how do you actually sell and price ads? Because at that time there was a program called AdWords Premium, which put ads at the top of the page of search results, and those ads were tied to keywords, but they were priced by a sales force. So if you were selling dog food and you wanted to show your ad next to anybody who was searching on dog food, then you would negotiate with the salesperson on what the price would be. And the price was expressed in dollars per thousand impressions. So $10 CPM might be a typical number, but where'd the $10 come from? Right? You talk to different salesmen, you might get a different number. And people started realizing that there were millions of different things that people were searching on, so there are millions of different keywords, and how do you come up with prices for all those millions of different words? Well, the auction was a good model because then essentially people were setting the prices themselves. So in the original Overture model, people bid for keywords to be shown. And Overture also had the idea of paying per click, so you didn't just have to pay per impression the way the rest of the advertising business worked, but you actually paid per click. The ads were assigned to slots depending on the bids. The highest bidders got the best slots, which tended to be the higher up slots, and also the highest bidder paid what he bid. So it's what an economist calls a first price auction. You enter your bid, somebody clicks on your ad, you pay what you bid, ads are ranked by bids, and that was the structure of the GoTo or Overture auction. So Google thought they could improve on that, and they improved on it in a couple different ways. Oh, well, here's an example. I should show you what I'm talking about. So the ads are based on query plus keywords. So the distinction in the industry is the query is what the user enters, the keyword is what the advertiser buys, and there's a question of whether the query matches the keyword or the keyword matches the query. And there can be exact match, where it has to be a precise match. There could be a broad match. There's phrase match. There's negative match. There's all sorts of different definitions of match. But basically, that's a fairly straightforward issue. And here are these top two ads. So that's what's called promoted ads, the ones that are get the most attention. And then there's the ads on the right-hand side over there on that side of the page. Okay, so that's a little picture of what the ads look like. Now, in the Google auction, the two improvements that they made were, in fact, instead of ranking the ads just by the bid, they ranked the ads times the price per click times the clicks per impression. So it's going to be the bid times the click-through rate. And if you think about it, what that's giving you is a price per impression, right? Price per click times clicks per impression is price per impression. And the reason that's noteworthy is that's what Google has to sell, an impression, an ad impression. So what you're doing is you want to sell the impression not just to the highest bidder, but to the advertiser that's going to generate the highest expected revenue. So think, for example, suppose you were selling 747s and you want to buy the keyword airplane. Well, there aren't that many people who want to buy 747s. I mean, Larry and Sergey, they've already got a plane anyway, so they're out of the market. There aren't that many people that want a 747, so even though Boeing would be willing to pay a very, very high price for an interested customer, you don't get many clicks. But you might have a model airplane maker who's selling little model airplanes. Lots of people might be interested in buying those, so you could have a higher expected revenue from showing a much, much cheaper ad if it had many more clicks. So the point is, it's much better to advertise on, it's much better to use a ranking based on expected revenue than on expected clicks. And then the second innovation was used a second price auction. So each bidder paid a price that was determined by the bidder beneath him, and the price was the minimum price necessary to retain the position. So you bid a certain amount, here's the guy below you. The price you had to pay was not what you bid, but it would be the price that would just be sufficient to keep you ahead of the nearest competition. And why is that? Well, there is an economic argument, which I'll mention in a minute, but it was really motivated by a computer engineering argument, namely, if you didn't have a first price auction, then each bidder would want to lower his price himself until he's just paying enough to meet the competition. Why pay more than you have to? You'd rather experiment with lowering the price. What that meant is you have to be logging on to your account minute by minute basis and keep adjusting your price to find the price that would just keep you in the position that you wanted to be in. So I put a very heavy load on the system. It was much better from Google's viewpoint to just do that adjustment for you. So it was what we called the AdWords discounter, automatically discounted the bid so as to be the minimum necessary to retain the position. And eventually Overture adopted both the second price model, which I just described, and also this last sentence says they're currently moving to improve ranking method. Actually, they moved to the ranking method last summer. So now Google and Overture, Google and Yahoo, are both basically using the same system as is Microsoft. So one of the interesting things you could do is, if we're going to do it all over again, there's another approach that's interesting, and that's what's called the Vickrey-Clark-Groves, or VCG pricing. I kind of joke that it's usually called VCG, except in San Diego, where we call it GCV, because Ted Groves is a faculty member here in the economics department and came up with this algorithm in his thesis several years ago. The idea there is, instead of placing your bid depending on what others are bidding, you could charge each advertiser the cost that he imposes on the other advertisers. Okay? So the way you think about that is, imagine all these advertisers ranked and say, what would happen if we took out the guy that was in position number 3? Well, then the person that was in 4 would move up to 3, the person that was in 5 would move up to 4, the person with 6 to move up to 5, and because they were each then in more prominent positions, they'd each get a few more clicks, and you could contemplate charging each advertiser the cost that he imposed on all the advertisers below him. And it turns out that with some analysis, you can show that under that system, the optimal bid is to report your true value per click, how much the click is actually worth to you. Under the current system, it turns out you don't want to report the true value per click. You'd like to bias your report down to some degree, but you still end up with essentially the same revenue as you would get through this VCG method. So there's been a lot of interesting work in the field of algorithmic mechanism design that looks at different mechanisms that you could use to do this kind of operation. This particular one has a lot of advantages, and we've done some experiments and thought about it, and maybe someday we might switch to using something a little different. Now, It's fairly straightforward to figure out what the outcome of the Google auction should be. When I first went to Google, Eric Schmidt asked me to take a look at the auction and see if I could apply some of the tools of game theory to formulate a model of what behavior looked like in that auction. And it's fairly straightforward to figure out what that is. And the basic principle that you want to utilize is the principle that in equilibrium, each bidder must prefer the position he's in to any other position. So think about a bidder. He's in position number 3. He could bid a little bit more. He'd move into position number 2. He'd pay more money, but he'd get more clicks. And so the question you have to ask yourself is are the extra clicks that I get worth the extra money I have to pay? Or if you're in position 3, you could bid a little less. You'd move down a slot. If you move down a slot, then you'd save some money, but you get fewer clicks. So again, you have to ask yourself the question of what are those, is the value that I save compensate me for losing the clicks? So just writing down those inequalities and manipulating them gives you a pretty good picture of what the Nash equilibrium looks like. It gives you a set of inequalities that you can use to describe equilibrium, but then maybe the more interesting thing is you convert those inequalities. So instead of saying, here's some values per click, what do the prices have to be to make this an equilibrium? You could look at it the other direction and say, here's the prices, what values were implied by those prices? So just as I mentioned a minute ago, when you look at this calculation in terms of are those extra clicks worth the extra amount I have to pay, you could flip that around and see, well, how much extra does he have to pay? That must be an upper bound on how much those extra clicks are worth. Okay? So it's a kind of a nice little trick. Given values, you can compute prices, or given prices, you can compute what values would be under the assumption that the advertisers are behaving in a rational way. They're making a rational choice. So, let's see here. The basic result that you get if you do this analysis is that the incremental cost per click, which is going to be the extra cost for the extra clicks, that has to be increasing in the click-through rate. As you move up the page, so you have higher and higher click-through rate, then the incremental cost per click has to increase. And the reason, from an economic point of view, is very simple, just what I wrote there. If the incremental cost per click ever went down, then what that means is that somebody bought expensive clicks, but they passed up cheap clicks. So if the cost of so I bought clicks that were worth 50 cents to me, and now the incremental cost of buying extra clicks is 30 cents, well, if the previous clicks were worth 50 cents, I should buy those clicks that are worth 30 cents. If I don't do that, I'm behaving irrationally, at least according to this model. So it's similar to what you see in standard intermediate microeconomics. You end up with price equal to marginal cost, which in this context says the value of the clicks has to equal the incremental cost per click, and the marginal cost has to be increasing, which is to say here the incremental cost has to be increasing in the click-through rate. So I've got a paper up on my website at Berkeley if you want to go through the mathematics of this. It's just an exercise in manipulating inequalities, but it's one of these things where you get perhaps a slightly interesting result that comes out of it. Now, let me give you a simple example here, just to get a feel for how you can use this economic analysis in this context. So let's look at a special case. Suppose that all the advertisers have a value per click V. So everybody's the same. There's two cases. One is undersold auctions, when there's more slots on the page than there are bidders, and the other case is oversold auctions. Those are the cases where there are more bidders than slots. So what do you do if you have an undersold auction? Well, it turns out the last ad on the page has to pay a reserve price, a minimum price, and it's a little bit complicated these days, but roughly speaking, let's say it's around 5 cents. So the minimum price per click in the undersold auction would be 5 cents. And if you have an oversold auction, well, then the last bidder pays the price determined by the first excluded bidder. Okay? So that'll be whatever the value of the click is to that excluded bidder. So let's look at the undersold pages. If they all have the same value, if everybody has the same value per click, then it must be that the profit per click that you're getting from being in slot S is equal to the profit per click that you could get if you were in the last slot in the page. Everybody's got the same price, the same value per click. They've got to be indifferent between all the different positions they could be in, and that gives you the equality in the middle of the page, and that says that the expenditure on slot S, PS times XS, the price per click times the number of clicks that you get in slot S, has to be equal to the expenditure you'd make on the bottom slot plus the value of those extra clicks. So before I was talking about these incremental costs per click, well, you have to look at the value of the extra clicks that you get, which is expressed right there. So payment for slot S is payment for the last position plus the value of the incremental clicks. Very simple. So example, you have 100 clicks in position 1, 80 clicks in position 2. Value per click is 50 cents. The reserve price per click is 5 cents. You solve that equation they had on the previous page, and you get a price per click for position 1 of 14 cents and a price per click of position 2, the reserve price, the minimum price that's specified in the model, of 5 cents. And then you get a certain amount of revenue, or if I did my algebra right, it's $18. Okay? So that's a little example of what the undersold case looks like. Now what about the oversold case? So there what happens is everybody has to be indifferent between having his slot and not being shown at all. So value minus the cost per click times the number of clicks has to equal 0, or the price has to equal the value. So as soon as you make people compete for those slots, then the price gets bid up to the value right away in this very simple example. So in the previous 2-slot example with 3 bidders, price is going to be 50 cents, revenue would be $90. Whoa! Before it was just $18. Now all of a sudden it's $90. And if you think about it, the logic is if I don't have to compete, if I'm getting a slot no matter what, that's the undersold case, then all that you're paying for is the position premium. All you're paying for is being in this little higher position. But as soon as you have to compete, so it means you either bid this much to get shown or you don't get shown at all, then the amount you're willing to pay is going to be far, far higher. And indeed, if you look at the data, which I guess I don't have here to show you, big chunk of the revenue at Google comes from the fully sold pages, the ones that are the most competitive, because that's where the advertisers are really forced to compete, and the prices then end up actually reflecting the true value. So that's a very useful insight, and we use this measure of fraction of the pages that are fully sold or oversold as a way of indicating how competitive conditions are in a particular country or particular vertical. So now let's think about the issue of the number of ads shown. So you can show more ads, and that pushes revenue up, but on the other hand, the relevancy goes down. So I'm thinking of a situation where there's a certain number of slots in the page, and the question is, how many ads do you want to show? You can show more ads, the relevancy goes down, and then our view is that if you show people less relevant ads, they're less likely to click, and in the future, they're less likely to look at ads. So you want to have relevancy as a goal. You don't just care about revenue today, but you care about revenue tomorrow. So you can formulate a model where the probability of a click depends on the degree of relevancy, and if the ad is deemed to be relevant by the user, they'll click more in the future. So you can look at a little stochastic dynamic programming model where you balance out the short-run profit from showing the ad with the long-run profit that you would get by encouraging people to click on more ads in the future. And indeed, we actually have a model of that sort which we use to drive this decision of where the relevancy cutoff should be for the ads. So I don't know if you've followed the news reports for the last few years, but Google's been emphasizing ad quality, ad quality, ad quality. So our view is we want to have fewer ads that are higher quality. They're more likely to get clicks. They're more likely to get conversions in the sense that the advertiser would then actually make a sale. And then, of course, if people are rewarded for clicking in the sense of getting something that they really find to be relevant, then they're much more likely to click in the future. And so a lot of the action in our group there at Google has been in trying to improve this ad quality. One interesting thing about how this works is the fact that in a Web 2.0 business like Google, where the product is really delivered in real time over the web, it's possible to engage in continuous improvement. Way back in the 80s, they had this Japanese method of manufacture called Kaizen, continuous improvement in production processes. So this was pioneered by the Japanese auto companies. They wanted to continuously improve production quality, tuning the assembly line, adjusting the worker behavior, changing the lighting, making small incremental improvements to make the product better and better and better, more and more reliable. Well, at Google, we're doing the same sort of thing on the software side because we can continually monitor user behavior, we can continually monitor advertiser behavior, we can run experiments in real time to see how changes in the parameters affect users' behavior and see what generates better quality searches and better revenue. So at any one time, Google is actually running hundreds of experiments. Now, some of you may have noticed this, that one day you do a search result, the next day you do the same search, it's something different. Sometimes the user interface is a little different. Sometimes you will be adjusting the lines on a separator bar by a few pixels, changing the color. Last year, we switched the color of the top ads from being blue to being yellow and saw a very substantial increase in the click-through rate and the revenue generated. So simple things like changing fonts, changing colors, changing page layouts, they can have a big impact on user behavior. And then more substantive changes like changing the ad ranking algorithm, changing the search algorithm. You can interleave the results, so one user sees this set of results, another user sees a different set of results. Look at the click-through rates, find the ones that give you the best response, and thereby continually improve your product. So we build an experimental infrastructure that allows us to run these hundreds of experiments at a time, and so the product is getting better on a day-by-day and week-by-week basis. So you've got very rapid and subtle improvement, and this learning by doing leads to significant competitive advantage. So building that experimental infrastructure is not so easy because it makes it a more complicated problem for web serving in some sense. On the other hand, it has a gigantic payoff because then you can continually improve your product. So my view is that marketing really is the new finance. Back in the 70s, we saw finance take a quantum leap because they had widely available data sets, computerized technology, analytic methods allows them to improve on marketing on finance quite dramatically. Well, nowadays we can do the same thing with marketing because just as Google has the capability of handling these kinds of real-time improvements on our system, we can offer that capability to advertisers and publishers to do real-time experimenting with their marketing mechanisms. So as an example, one of the things you can do with these little search ads is you can offer Google 3 different creatives. So instead of saying, here's my search ad, period, you can say, well, here are 3 shots, pick the one that's best. So Google will rotate those 3 different creatives and find the one that's performing best in terms of the click-through rate, and that's definitely in the interest of the advertiser. And the same thing on the publisher side. So suppose a user comes to the advertiser's site. The advertiser has a lot of questions about how that should be laid out, what font should it use, what colors, what link structure, etc. You can rotate different different page configurations and see which one is performing the best, and do this, again, in real time. So that's part of Google Analytics, allows you to do this web page optimization that allows a publisher to decide that this particular layout or this particular structure is giving much better performance than another structure. So again, it's a case where the products can evolve in real time and continuously improve. So what we believe is that the quantitative methods for analyzing this kind of commercial data are extremely valuable. Having a good system for storing and manipulating that data is critical. Having a system to do experimentation is paramount, and really we're just at the beginning in terms of exploiting these kinds of systems for improved economic performance. So that's pretty much the message I'd like to leave you with. And I'm happy to take questions. So, thank you. Questions? Yes?
So how do you measure the cost of visibility? Like I understand that when you do ads on Google or Yahoo or Amazon or any other website, there is a cost attached to the visibility also.
To the visibility?
Yeah. I don't think it is very easy to measure the ROI on the ads that you give on Google, but companies do say that, okay, we are visible, so we are gaining something.
Okay.
How do you measure that?
Okay, so the question is, how do you measure the value of the visibility? And the way we refer to that internally is we say, what about the impression value? What's the value of the impression itself as opposed just the click? Well, the kind of interesting thing there is, in a way, the auction that we're running is an auction for impressions, because remember, we're ranking based on price per click times clicks per impression. And in some sense, what the advertiser is bidding on that price per is that price per impression. So in general, it's not something that we're really in a position to tell the advertiser what they should be doing. The advertiser has to make this judgment about how much those impressions are really worth. We can help you in measuring the value of the click and the value of the conversion, but this judgment of how much the impression value is worth is something the advertisers really have to decide pretty much on their own. There's also another component to this, another little subtlety, is, of course, if you're in a business where you make repeat sales, all right, in that case, having a new user of your website doesn't just revolve around how much that person purchases today, but also there's some value in the fact that they'll come back next week or next month or sometime in the future and purchase more things. So if you look at this, particularly for people who are selling online vitamins or something where there's going to be repeat purchases, then it's typically the case that the relevant variable is the value per lifetime value of a user, where you're trying to look at the value the person will contribute over the course of their relationship. So there's also some subtleties in estimating that. Other questions? Yes?
I have a question that has to do with the improvement in ad quality we were talking about.
Yep.
It seems like a couple of years ago when I went to Google, no matter what query I typed in, there'd always be a sponsored link from Amazon saying, look up books about, whatever I typed in. And then you'd click it, and there really would be nothing there.
Yeah.
And so I'm wondering if that's something that, it seems like it isn't happening as much. I don't know if Amazon decided, okay, that was useless, or if you guys, Google, pushed them to say, okay, you're degrading the quality of having our sponsored links because people are getting frustrated when there's nothing really there that's relevant.
Well, that's exactly the kind of example that I'm referring to. eBay had the same issue where whatever you typed in, they'd say buy X on eBay. And that actually turned out to be a bit of a problem because you'd see things like, buy dead babies on eBay. And so this was a little, but then it turns out there is some punk rock band called Dead Babies. So it makes, the problem is we didn't have all those stupid band titles, it would be a lot easier because the thing is, it's exactly that where you're trying to look not just at whether people click, so that's this question of the click-through rate, but then you might want to look at indicators of landing page quality. So if you click through to an ad and you click right back within a second, that's probably a pretty bad ad because it's got a bad landing page and induced the person to click, but the experience that they had was not something that was really very useful. So that measure of of short clicks or click duration turns out to be a good measure for ad quality as well. And actually, we have an index of ad quality that uses 20 or so different indicators to try to measure performance. Yes?
How did that performance measure change when tabbed browsing was invented?
When what? Oh, tab browsing. Yeah, that's a interesting issue too. What we do is we have human evaluators who we show ads to, typical users, typical user study. They look at ads, we record all sorts of characteristics of the ads, and then we use machine learning, statistical techniques to find the indicators that seem to be most in accord with the human user evaluation. So as the technology changes, these functions automatically get adjusted. So if as tab browsing, for example, becomes more and more prevalent, then this comes up in the as a potential signal for the human evaluation studies. Other questions? Yes.
So you talked about the power of using the auction to allow in some sense, the advertisers to do your job for you in terms of setting the prices.
Absolutely.
But an interesting thing is, of course, the advertisers are competing against themselves, and so I think we're all sort of aware of the notion of click fraud. But I'm very curious if you believe that that's a mechanism, if that is a phenomena that can be countered through economic means as well. In other words, I know of a lot of mechanisms to combat click fraud that have to do with who's doing the clicking, or these bots and so forth. But do you believe that that's something that the market itself can be made robust to, or is that an externality that we need other mechanisms to deal with?
So we have a whole team of people that works on click fraud and other kinds of fraud, and all of our obviously I can't talk about the details of how that works, but they're all the obvious things we catch and many of the much less obvious things. Interesting, I mean, there are many amusing stories about this, but unfortunately I can't reveal. There are some things that are purely economic in nature. For one thing, we have this system called smart pricing. So if you look at publishers, there are high-quality publishers, which in this context means the advertisements get a lot of attention and clicks. And then there are low-quality publishers, where people don't tend to stay on those publishers very long and the ads don't get many clicks, etc. There's something we call MFA pages, which are made-for-ads pages, and you've probably encountered these when you do a query. You'll do a query on headaches. You'll be taken to a page where it's about headaches, but maybe there's a copy of the Wikipedia article about headaches, and then there's a whole bunch of ads associated with organic headache remedies or whatever. Those are not very good pages from Google's point of view, and if they don't convert well, if advertisers who go to those pages, if people go to the pages and click on the ads but don't end up buying, then those publishers get penalized in various ways. So we have a lot of performance measures. We're trying to look at not just do people click, but do they find the ads useful, and do they buy? Is of course the strongest ultimate indicator. So there's a lot of stuff like this where we're trying to get performance measures which actually relate to what users' interests are, because that's the most important constituent in our of the groups that we serve. Yes? Yeah, so how do we know if somebody buys? Well, we have this service called conversion tracking, and what happens is if you want to, if you're an advertiser, you can ask Google to track your conversions, track your purchases, and then tie those back to the clicks and creatives and all those other things, so you can improve the quality of your ads by looking at whether they resulted in actual purchases. So it's just a program for advertisers, but of course we can also use that aggregate data as a performance measure.
So the information is that, but is there enough information in the system? How do you tell the difference between a buy that came via somebody's seeing a Google sponsored ad versus just a direct?
Yeah, so the question was, how do we know that a particular purchase came from a Google-sponsored ad versus somebody who just went directly? And the answer is, when the ad is clicked, then there's a cookie set, and then later on, when a purchase is made on this conversion tracking system, it said, oh, there was a Google ad that was clicked on within the last, 24 hours. So the system is set up to link the clicks to the ads. Yes, way in the back.
Has there been any proven method for sites such as Google to make revenue off of YouTube or any of the
So YouTube is a great example. One of the projects this year is to try to figure out ways to monetize YouTube more effectively. And we've experimented with, I think, over 20 different ad formats on YouTube, doing exactly the kind of thing I described a few minutes ago, where these are typically very carefully designed experiments with treatment and control. So you're randomizing which user gets to see which kind of ad and trying to figure out which ads perform best. There's a couple problems there. One problem is advertisers like to review what their ad is being shown next to because they have their own brand perception and brand image of the product. So that introduces this human delay into the system. There's a situation of the user doesn't want the viewing experience to be interrupted. After all, a lot of these videos on YouTube are just a few minutes long, so you don't want to run through a bunch of commercials to watch the videos. So the trick is to find the right balance between an ad which is relevant and yet not obtrusive. And so that's the trade-off we're trying to make of exactly where we want to be in that context. I think there are actually lots of commercial opportunities on YouTube, and it's just going to be a challenge of finding out which ones are most effective. But we're doing it in a pretty systematic manner of trying to do exactly that. Any other questions? Yes, here's one. So that's an extremely interesting question, and the cheap answer is it was a user interface decision. So in fact, Google has 8 right-hand side ad slots and up to 3 top ad slots, and that was determined way back at the beginning because we wanted to have 10 ads, and if you had 10 search results, and then it turns out that 8 ads fit in about that same position. So the question is, would you want to change that maximum number of ads per page? And it's possible you would. I have much more elaborate models of what might go into that decision. But the tricky part is, of course, it's not just the revenue side of things that matters, but it's the user's attention or cognitive overload. You may not want to search through a list of 15 ads. Maybe you'd be much happier searching through a list of 6 ads. So right now, I would say we're not tinkering with that dimension because we don't really feel that we have enough information to find out the best answer. And the default that we have of 8 ads seems to work pretty well in practice. Yes?
Things like the Google checkout, with respect to distinguishing that from other more well-known websites like Amazon or...
Yeah, so the Google checkout, we view that as primarily a service to the merchant. So the idea there is that the merchant and the user, so it's a situation where if you fill out your information in Google checkout, then you've basically got one-click shopping for the internet, because you can go to any other checkout merchant, it'll fill in all of your address information and your credit card information and everything else, so you can make that purchase a lot easier. So Google Checkout is primarily a way of providing fraud control, a payment system for the merchant, convenience for the user, and it just is like making these transactions less costly or providing lubrication for the transactions so people find it easier to buy things on the internet. So it's not meant to be a profit center for Google. It's really meant to be a way to facilitate internet commerce and make life a lot easier for both merchants and users. So I think I'll take one more question, and then we'll end. Over here.
What percent of total revenues comes just from ads?
98%. So huge amount. It's all basically all coming from ads. There's some other businesses. We're providing Google Apps, so we're providing email service for universities. So University of Arizona outsourced all of its email service to Google. We have some other models like that, but right now it's really very much an ad-driven business. And it's not just the online ads. Today I've talked about search ads. There's also, of course, the contextual ads. That's AdSense. And then there are also radio, TV, and print ads. We're providing advertising services for those media. So again, it's really the model of the Yenta, the two-sided market, where you're matching up people with things to buy, people who want to people who want to buy things to people who want to sell them. And what we've been focusing on is trying to find matches that are the most effective in terms of making those arrangements. So that's the model that we've been pursuing, and we're going to continue to pursue that for the foreseeable future. Well, thank you very much. It's been a pleasure.